I was in high school in the early 1980s when evangelical Christians first started focusing on abortion. And the one thing we all agreed on was that overturning Roe v. Wade was the key to reducing abortion in America. 40 years later, we still haven't overturned Roe. Today, some pro-life evangelical Christians are asking whether this is still the right focus of so much of our attention. Is overturning Roe the key to reducing abortion? Our friend David French made an argument that really got us thinking. And when my podcast co-host, Skye Jethani, echoed that argument on Twitter, people said, hey, you should make a video about that. So, we did. Here's my buddy Skye trying to answer the question, is overturning Roe v. Wade the key to reducing abortion in America? And if it isn't, what is? It's okay if you disagree, but it's worth having the conversation. Okay? Here it is.
For almost 50 years, Christians have been told that who you support for president will either save or sacrifice the lives of unborn babies. This has led a lot of pro-life Christians to become single-issue voters, willing to overlook everything else about a candidate as long as they're against abortion. When a candidate's bad character or unchristian policies are brought up, the response is often, yeah, but abortion. The argument looks something like this. My vote determines the president nominates justices to the Supreme Court can overturn Roe v. Wade, and overturning Roe will make abortion illegal and save babies. Let's unpack what's wrong with this argument and why your vote for president might not impact abortion the way you think. Let's look at three common assumptions. Number one, a Republican president will appoint pro-life justices to the Supreme Court to end abortion. Since the Roe decision in 1973, Republican presidents have appointed 11 justices to the Supreme Court, and very soon it could be 12. Democratic presidents have only appointed 4. For 49 of the last 50 years, Republicans have held the majority on the Supreme Court. Despite this Republican domination of the court for 5 decades, it hasn't overturned Roe. For example, in 1992, Republicans had an 8-1 majority on the Supreme Court. 5 of those 8 Republican justices had been appointed by Reagan or Bush, both stridently pro-life presidents. And that one Democratic justice on the court, Byron White, he voted against Roe in 1973. But when a case came before the court that year which could have overturned Roe, the Republican-appointed justices didn't do it. Instead, they reaffirmed the right to an abortion. And even as recently as 2020, a Louisiana law restricting abortion was struck down by Chief Justice John Roberts, who was appointed by George W. Bush. And here's the important part. In his ruling, Roberts cited the legal principle of stare decisis. That's the belief that the court should abide by its previous rulings. So for decades, the Republican-dominated Supreme Court has only reaffirmed rather than reversed Roe v. Wade. And if Chief Justice Roberts says the court should abide by its previous rulings, it's looking less and less likely that the court will ever overturn Roe, no matter how many conservatives are on it. That's why David French, a civil liberties lawyer and strong pro-life conservative, says this. For almost 3 decades, the Supreme Court lesson has been clear. Put not your trust in judges to rescue America from the moral stain of abortion. Right now, you might be thinking, but Skye, those justices from the 80s and 90s were too moderate. We still need more serious pro-life people on the Supreme Court, and then things will change. That brings us to the second assumption. Overturning Roe is the key to ending abortion. Politicians talk about Roe v. Wade a lot. Republicans get their voters excited by promising to overturn it, and Democrats get their voters fired up by vowing to defend it. You'd think the entire issue of abortion hangs on this one case, but the truth is a lot more complicated than that. Here's what people forget. The Roe decision in 1973 did not legalize abortion, and simply reversing Roe wouldn't make it illegal. For example, according to the CDC, in 1972, the year before Roe, there were nearly 600,000 legal abortions in the U.S. That doesn't account for the thousands of abortions that were unreported or performed by unlicensed doctors. And in those states where abortion was illegal before Roe, it was still way more common than you might think. In Michigan, for example, in 1971 to 72, nearly 30,000 women traveled to New York for an abortion. We might assume that because biblical values were commonplace at America's founding, that abortion must have been illegal and super rare until recently. But actually, it's just the opposite. In 1776, abortion was legal everywhere in the United States. In fact, abortion was so widespread in America in the 19th century that one doctor in Missouri said, quote, "The evidence will bear out the assertion that in no age of the world has there been a more reckless disregard for the lives of unborn human beings than in this present age, and among the civilized and professedly Christianized nations of the earth." And that was in 1874, nearly 100 years before Roe v. Wade. Significant restrictions on abortion didn't start appearing in some states until the late 19th and early 20th century. But even after those laws were passed, in the 1930s, doctors still performed an estimated 800,000 abortions every year. That's about the same number that's happening today. So the idea that before Roe, abortion was illegal and rare in America is just not true. That false narrative, however, is very useful to both political parties. Republicans act like the country before Roe was a Christian utopia, and Democrats present the pre-Roe America as a hell on earth for women, but neither's entirely true. That's also why overturning Roe wouldn't be a decisive win. Instead, we would just return to the state-by-state patchwork of laws that existed before 1973. And just like before 1973, women living in a state without abortion could still cross state lines to see a doctor or just order an abortion-inducing drug over the internet, which wasn't possible in 1973. According to the study, the most optimistic outcome would be a nationwide reduction of 12%. That's why David French said, quote, "Even if Roe is overturned, abortion will be mostly unchanged in the U.S." End quote. I know what you're thinking. But Sky, 12% is still a lot of abortions. That's a lot of babies. If overturning Roe will save even 1%, isn't it worth it? Yes, of course it is. The issue is not whether overturning Roe would help. It would. The issue is what will help the most. Should Christians continue following the same path they've been on for the last 50 years of ignoring every other issue to elect a pro-life president, to appoint pro-life justices, to overturn one case, to maybe someday hopefully reduce abortions by 12%? Or is there a better way to tackle this problem right now that has nothing to do with who's president? Let's look at two states, one red and one blue. Between 2011 and 2014, Texas passed a number of laws restricting abortion. As a result, abortions declined by 28%. That's more than double the reduction if Roe was overturned. Delaware, a blue state, did even better. Between 2014 and 2017, Delaware improved access to health care for its poorest residents. As a result, abortions in that state declined by an encouraging 37%. 3 times more than overturning Roe alone would accomplish. While the politicians have everyone on both sides focused on defending or reversing Roe, we're missing the local and state policies that are actually impacting abortion right now. Roe is a piece of the very complicated pro-life puzzle, but it's just a piece, and not even a very big one. Putting aside Roe and the Supreme Court for a minute, let's talk about the last assumption. Number 3. The policies of Republican presidents reduce abortions and those of Democrats increase them. Okay, this is where we need to separate rhetoric from reality. If you look at the two parties' platforms, they couldn't be more different on the issue of abortion. The Republican Party is undeniably pro-life, and every Republican presidential candidate has advocated pro-life policies for 40 years. The Republican platform calls for overturning Roe, no public funding of abortions, and defunding Planned Parenthood. The Democratic Party platform is the opposite. It calls for supporting Roe, taxpayer funding of abortions, and the expansion of Planned Parenthood. If you only look at these platforms, everything seems cut and dry. But the data actually shows something much more complicated. The fact is, abortions have fallen under every president, both Republican and Democrat, for 4 decades. And today, the abortion rate is actually lower than before Roe became law. In other words, electing a Democrat does not increase abortions. Let's complicate things even more. The abortion rate in America actually fell the most under Barack Obama. On the flip side, in 2019, while Donald Trump was president and the Republicans controlled the Senate, Planned Parenthood, the country's largest abortion provider, broke its record for taxpayer funding. Now, to be clear, I don't think Obama was responsible for reducing abortions during his term, and I don't think Trump was the reason Planned Parenthood broke its public funding record. Like so much about this issue, things are more complicated than that. But this much is clear. The person sitting in the Oval Office is not what matters most when it comes to reducing abortions. Their Supreme Court appointments haven't mattered. Their party platforms haven't mattered. And their rhetoric hasn't mattered. So what has mattered? Why have abortions been declining steadily since the 1980s? Again, it's complicated, but a big factor is that fewer women are facing unplanned pregnancies. Sexual activity among teens is way down compared to 20 years ago, and more women have access to health care and long-lasting contraceptives. Some states have also passed laws requiring a waiting period before an abortion. They've limited public funding and restricted late-term abortions. Others have pushed to make adoption more affordable. All of these have contributed to reducing abortions. None of them required Roe to be overturned, and none of them happened because of the president, the Supreme Court, or anyone else in Washington. So what have we learned? We've learned that despite 11 conservative, Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court, for the last 50 years the court has only upheld rather than reversed abortion rights, and that's unlikely to change. And even if the court did overturn Roe, it would have very little impact because abortion was widely available before Roe, and it would be after. We've also seen that the president and his party have had no impact on abortion as the rate has steadily fallen under both Republican and Democratic administrations due to local and state efforts that have nothing to do with Washington. Finally, we've learned that there are things to be encouraged about too. Abortion rates have fallen dramatically, and they're still going down. And according to a 2020 Notre Dame study, 75% of Americans say abortion should be illegal or only legal under certain circumstances. In other words, there is wide support for common sense limits on abortion. Even more importantly, the Notre Dame study found that most women, including most pro-choice women, do not want an abortion. That may explain why local and state efforts to reduce abortions are so effective. Better adoption laws, waiting periods, crisis pregnancy centers, churches and support groups who are actually on the ground helping women and walking with them through their pregnancies, that's what's making a difference. Regarding the importance of local engagement, David French says this: if you're pro-life, the encouraging reality is those things that matter most, your relationships and your local political community, are the things over which you have the most influence. The things that matter the least, the presidency and national politics, are those things most removed from your daily life. But I've been around the pro-life movement enough to know that we often get this exactly backwards. We're most passionate about the president, yet too many of us are less interested in the crisis pregnancy center down the street. And after researching the ineffectiveness of the president and Supreme Court, a professor of Catholic studies at DePaul University said this, quote, "The one strategy for reducing abortions that has been proven to work runs through love, not power. Support for women who may not feel able to carry a pregnancy to term. This requires not blind allegiance to a political party, but the promotion of a culture of life." End quote. There may be good reasons to vote for a Republican candidate for president, but overturning Roe or thinking the president will reduce abortions isn't one of them. Likewise, there are things about the Democratic Party platform I still strongly disagree with, including abortion, but the data clearly shows that voting a Democrat into the White House does not increase abortions. If we really care about solving this problem, then we need to stop being manipulated by parties and candidates and get our focus off the presidential election. Instead, we should focus on what's happening right in front of us, in our states, our communities, and in our neighborhoods. And whether abortion is legal or not, there will always be women who need our help. That means the ultimate answer is going to require compassion and not the Supreme Court. So if you think which lever you pull in the voting booth every 4 years is what makes you pro-life, it might be time to think again.